You're about to hear one of the most fascinating stories of the 20th century, and it's remarkable to me that more people don't know about it. It involves intellectuals, writers, musicians, poets, risking their lives to save mostly documents, pieces of art, pieces of music, ideas. This is the story of the Paper Brigade. We start our story during World War II. One of the agencies of the Nazi regime was called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or the ERR. And this organization was tasked with taking, finding, pillaging, bringing back to Germany items of cultural significance. Could be artworks, paintings, sculptures, could be important documents. And there was a special division within that organization that was focused specifically on finding items that were valuable to the Jewish community. And the idea was that at some point, after the destruction of the Jewish people, they were going to be able to use this collection of items to create a museum about these people who have been destroyed. And so they went through Europe and they tried to identify items that they thought would be valuable to add to this collection. Prior to World War II, Vilnius, or Vilna in Yiddish, was a very important center of Jewish learning. Vilna at the time was not the most populated of Jewish cities. It was a relatively small city compared to some of the larger European capitals of the time, but it was a heavily Jewish city. In other words, a very large percentage of the city was Jewish, and because of certain historical events, it became a very important center for Jewish learning and Jewish community. There were many Jewish schools and synagogues and all sorts of different organizations. And prior to World War II, one very important organization that was established in Vilna was called the Jiddischer Wissenschaftler Institute, or today it's abbreviated to YIVO. And this was an organization that was committed to the study and the championing of not just Jewish history and Jewish culture, but also specifically Yiddish histories, things associated with the Yiddish language, which at the time was the primary language spoken by the vast majority of Jews. By the time World War II reached what today is Lithuania, the YIVO, this institute, had already amassed almost 1 million different books and artifacts. When the Nazis occupied the city, they very quickly identified the importance of YIVO as a hub for the ERR to start to loot some of these artifacts and rare books. And they in fact used the same building that the Jewish community themselves had established as a collection point as their own collection point. In addition to the items that were already collected there, they started bringing in other items from ransacked libraries throughout the region, as well as over 300 synagogues around the area, some different schools, some different private libraries. They used them as a collection point to assemble them here at YIVO in Lithuania. And the goal was to identify the most important, the most valuable items, and to ship those back to Germany to be used for a museum in the future. The problem was that there was so much material that they were overwhelmed. They didn't know how to identify which things were important enough to bring back, and they couldn't bring it all back. So the Nazis established a rule that they wanted to bring about 20% of the most important and most valuable items back to Germany, and the rest were going to be destroyed. Now, these were mostly books, and so what they did is the ones that were going to be slated for destruction were actually pulped, and they were made into recycling paper for other books. Some other items that were made out of leather, like Torah scrolls, which is a very important religious text for the Jewish people. Because those were made out of leather and were more sturdy, a lot of them were cut up and used to make the foot inserts for boots for German military personnel. Now, the vast majority of this collection is not in English, of course. It's not even in German. It was in Hebrew, and of course, Yiddish was the largest extent of the collection. And the Nazi personnel, for the most part, were completely ignorant of those languages, and so they didn't have any kinds of resources to be able to sort through all of these items and identify what was important. So instead, they created a slave labor group of about 40 individuals who were intellectuals, archivists, people who were already affiliated with YIVO, poets, some musicians, painters, and they had these people come to the YIVO, to the building where all of these things were being collected, and their job was to sort through and catalog everything and identify the things that were most important. And at a certain point, those people became aware that 20% of these items were going to be shipped back to Germany, and the vast majority, the remaining 80%, were going to be slated for destruction. Amongst this group of prisoners who were brought here to do this slave labor task were two very important people, Avram Sutzkever and Shlomo Katcherginski. Both of these people were poets and just coincidentally happened to be very good friends prior to this. There was also a literary group prior to World War II called Young Vilna that these two were also associated with. And so they had worked together quite a bit. Avram Sutzkever is widely regarded today as perhaps the greatest writer of the Yiddish language, or at least the greatest poet of the Yiddish language, which is quite stunning because at the time, the vast majority of Jews spoke Yiddish as their primary. It was either their first or their only language. And very shortly after World War II, that number declined drastically. Until now, we're at the point where Yiddish is actually not a dying language, but it's mostly spoken only by very religious communities who, for the most part, are actually uninterested in some of this poetry and literature if it's secular. And so even though this person came at the height of the development of this language and is regarded as one of the greatest writers of this language, he's mostly forgotten today, except for in small circles of Yiddish academics. Now, this group of intellectuals had been so devoted to preserving all of these items and creating them themselves, and now they were faced with an impossible choice. If they wanted to survive, they had to take part in this Nazi plan to ship back only a fifth of these items, knowing that the rest were going to be destroyed. And what a horrible choice to make. On one hand, you're going to be selecting some pieces that are going to be lost forever. And on the other hand, you're selecting pieces that are going to create this museum of your own destruction. Well, at the time, many people who worked outside of the ghetto for jobs like this were risking their lives to smuggle things back into the ghetto. Pretty much in all other circumstances, that meant food. So they would risk their lives, they worked outside of the ghetto, they might have access to food, and they would try to smuggle them back into the ghetto. And if they were inspected on the way back in and they were caught, of course, the consequences could be severe. But what people in the group of intellectuals decided to do is they decided that instead of smuggling food, they could smuggle a certain amount of historical items back into the ghetto. And once in the ghetto, they could find places where those items could be preserved. This group of people became known as the Paper Brigade. And the strategy worked like this. If they were able to take some of these important items and bring them back to Germany, at a certain point they figured that eventually Germany would lose the war and those items would most likely be preserved. And the people who came and won the war, the Allies, eventually would be able to find those items later. And the other items that they weren't able to save, they would try to identify amongst themselves which ones were important enough to risk their lives to smuggle back into the ghetto. So sometimes they would stuff it into their clothing. If they were small enough or certain shapes, they might be able to put it into their shoes. And there was also times where they were supposed to be working in the archives, going through these materials, and the German soldiers who were supervising would take lunch breaks. Now, you might be wondering, during these lunch breaks, wasn't there an opportunity to escape? Maybe, but they probably wouldn't have gotten very far. It was still extremely dangerous. If you walked outside of this building, where would you be able to go? You wouldn't be able to get very far without losing your life or at least risking your life. So that wasn't a primary concern. But during a lot of these lunch breaks, some of the items were being able to be smuggled and to be given to non-Jewish Lithuanians who were mostly other academics or archivists. There were some notable people who were able to smuggle those out. But the vast majority of works that were able to be saved, they did so by smuggling them back into the ghetto. Once in the ghetto, they might put them under floorboards. Sometimes they were inside walls. And in some cases, they actually shared space with the Vilna partisans. Basically the resistance movement in the ghetto had their own secret underground bunkers, and they had crates of weapons, and right next to them now would be crates of books and documents and paintings. I'm going to pause for a moment just to share that all of these videos that I create take a lot of time. They take time to research and write, record, and edit. And I would love your support if you're able to help the work that I do. The very easiest thing you can do is like and subscribe. That helps me out with the algorithm quite a bit, actually, and it's very easy to do. And if you'd really like to support the work that I'm doing, I have a Patreon page where I share other insights throughout each month about various topics of music, things about world music, classical music, different types of performers, things about music theory. If you're interested in that, there's a Patreon link in the description to this video. By the time World War II was over, the vast majority of the members of the Paper Brigade did not survive. It started with around 40 of them, and there were about 7 or 8 people who survived. But amongst those survivors were these 2 poets, Avram Sutzkever and Shlomo Katcherginski, and they led an effort after the war to return to Vilna and start digging up floorboards and going back to walls and bunkers, all the places that they had hidden these documents, and start to retrieve those collections. And they even assembled a small museum in Vilna at the time. But very soon after that, they found themselves threatened again, this time by Soviet occupation. And so they made the decision to transfer the majority of these works to a new YIVO that was established in New York City. And that is where the majority of them actually remain today. Some of those materials stayed behind in Vilnius. In fact, a lot of them were hidden by an archivist in a church, and they were only brought back to life after the fall of the Soviet Union, when things were more accessible and it was easier to move documents back and forth. In total, it's estimated that the Paper Brigade saved about 30,000 documents. In addition to that, the poet and musician that I mentioned, Shlomo Katcherginski, actually also tried to preserve many of the songs from the ghetto itself, and he did this by memorizing songs while he was there and then recording them after the war. That was his intention in memorizing them actually during the war. He figured there might be a time where he would have that chance to do that. Toward the end of the war, both of those poets, Sutzkever and Katcherginski, ended up joining partisans. They traded their pens for rifles and fought for the remainder of the war before it was all clear for them to go and return home and try to find some of these materials that they had hidden. Now, I want to share just one important item associated with this collection. I mentioned this musician, poet named Shlomo Katcherginski, and he wrote the lyrics for this really incredible song called Friling, which means springtime. The music was written by Avram Brudno, and this song is about Katcherginski being in the ghetto, and he's walking through the streets, and he's remembering that this time last year, this last spring, his wife was with him, and now she's no longer here. She's not alive anymore, and he wanders through the streets and he remembers all of these memories that are associated with his wife, who now is not here. And it's actually part of this tradition that I've noticed specifically about Yiddish songs, but also in many songs, which is that often the most sad songs have the happiest titles. And this title is called Friling, which means springtime. But if you pay attention to what the song is talking about, it's quite sad. So I'll perform for you just the first verse and the chorus of this song.
Ich plunge im Ghetto von Gessel zu Gessel und kenn nicht gefinnen kein Ort. Nicht da ist mein Lieber, wie trockt man rüber, Menschen no sagt Gott ein Wort. Es leicht auf mein Heim ist der Himmel, der Bläue, Wosche hab ich jetzt davon. Ich steh wie ein Bettler bei jedweden Treue und bettel a bissel Sonn. Friling, nimmst du mein Treue und bring mein Liebsten, mein Dreier zurück. Friling, auf deine Flügel bläue und nimm mein Herz mit und gib es ob mein Glück. Friling, auf deine Flügel bläue und nimm mein Herz mit und gib es ob mein Glück.
We learn about history, not just for the sake of learning about the past, but also for thinking about what are the things to come. In fact, I have another video that is trying to use a thought experiment to think about what music might sound like in another 1,000 years, and I'd love for you to join me there if you're interested. But these lessons that we can take from history can be extremely important, and I think the best way to honor these people who risk their lives to bring information to the next generation is to also share that story and to tell people about all of their sacrifices, and in fact, remember some of the artworks and the manuscripts and the documents that they saved.